and welcome to another episode of Sustainable Sustainability, where we talk to steward leaders who are creating profitable solutions to today's existential challenges. My name is Rajiv Peshavria, and I have today with me my co-host, Taimur Nabili. Hi, Taimur.
Hey, Rajiv. How you doing?
Good.
Good to have our guest on today. Fraser Thompson is an old friend of both you and I and of Singapore. He's now back in Australia running an outfit called Cyan Ventures. Fraser, great to have you on the show. I'm not going into great detail of your background and your professional accomplishments and history because we're going to put that up on the webpage with all that. We want to get straight into what you're doing with Cyan Ventures. But first of all, thanks for being on the show. How are you?
Very well. Thanks, Timo, and thanks, Rajiv, for having me on the show. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Now, look, the last time we spoke, you were involved in a massive, extraordinarily ambitious plan to bring the sunlight of Australia into Southeast Asia via a long cable. Sadly, that plan has not come to fruition, not because of any lack of viability, but because of other factors. But it's led you to Cyan Ventures and what you have now positioned yourself as the guy who's looking for big bets. Tell me a little bit about what the big bet is in the sustainability space and the considerations surrounding this new venture.
Thanks very much, Teo. I led a piece of research back in 2021 with Temasek and the World Economic Forum, which looked at the business and investment opportunities associated with the energy and nature transition. And when we talk about the energy and nature transition, we tend to have a narrative which is one that's more of risk than opportunity. And of course, there are risks to business as usual, but there are also really important opportunities.
And our work in the Asia-Pacific region showed that there was roughly US $4 trillion of business opportunities associated with this clean energy and nature transition just in the Asia-Pacific region alone.
Just expand on that a little, if you would. The idea of $4 trillion worth of opportunities, where, how, and but it seems like an extraordinary figure and one that not a lot of people are talking about.
It's true. We don't talk about it a lot, and I think there's many structural reasons why we don't talk about it. One is that we don't have a good research analyst sector that's actually looking at this like they would a typical sector, and so we have a fundamental information failure when it comes to looking at these opportunities. So the opportunities that we looked at were in three systems. The first was the food, land, and ocean use system. The second is around the built environment system, so all the buildings and the mobility around those. And then the third was in the energy and minerals system. And if you look at those three systems, we then looked at talking to experts, talking to business leaders, what are the available business opportunities with known technologies? So these are not things that are kind of pie in the sky, things that we may hope and we flying cars kind of thing. These are things that we have clear visibility on now that business leaders could go after with the right business models. And out of that was roughly about 67 different business opportunities. And we then sized how big they were in terms of investment, the business returns, and the jobs. And that's where we got that US $4 trillion number from.
Fraser, that's amazing to hear about the opportunities. And we want to dig into those a little bit more later in the conversation. But, take us back first to the risks. In your white paper, you talked about the fact that in Australia, the narrative is more around risk than opportunity. So remind us first what the risks are of inaction, and then we'll come back to the opportunities, which is, of course, much more exciting.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of risks that we don't fully appreciate. Here in Australia, a lot of the risks can touch every single sector of the economy. Some of it is around agriculture, so the potential climate change impacts and biodiversity impacts, reducing agricultural productivity, and that means reduced yields and reduced profitability in that sector. There's also a number of impacts, though, that around just heat itself. So the heat impacts on workers, those workers who are outside, and that's still a large share of our workforce, is quite significant, and it could look to about 7 to 8% labour productivity decreases with the heat impacts reducing the efficiency of those people who are working outdoors. And then, of course, you have the property sector, which is at risk from a range of climate change and biodiversity impacts, such as rising sea levels. So it touches every single sector of the economy. And we had some research previously from the World Economic Forum that looked at just the biodiversity impacts of the GDP risks, and that was up to half of GDP could potentially be at risk from declining nature and biodiversity services. And so these are really big and quite important numbers that we really need to understand. And we're starting to get better mechanisms to look at those risks. So, the task force for nature-based financial disclosures is coming into force in many countries. That's starting to ramp up. And it's going to be a really important agenda for business leaders to get a hold of.
You said, the mindset and the focus seems to be more on risk prevention than on opportunity. Talk to us a little bit more about that. What do you mean there?
Yeah, I think there's across many of the boardrooms where I've been talking to business leaders, a lot of them are coming at these issues around the energy and particularly the nature transition at a fairly early stage, and often the first touch point for companies is around things around regulatory disclosures. So I mentioned this task force for nature-based financial disclosures that has quite a significant amount of implications for businesses. They have to report on and value how big an impact these could be on their business models. So that obviously hits the kind of compliance mechanism of businesses, and then that filters through into the boardrooms as directors of these companies realize that they have to be across this because that's part of their governance requirements for the job that they're doing. So it's kind of natural that, I guess, the conversation starts with a risk-based focus. But it is really important that we have this as well as this opportunity mindset as well, because otherwise we're really just focusing on the downside, but not really focusing on that pivot that's needed to capture this upside potential.
One of the interesting things that you also pointed out, and the reason why the Cyan model is this big bets model, is what you're saying is that in Australia in particular, the perceived risk is actually not necessarily aligned with the actual risk, that what the absence of innovation and investment in Australia is because people think there's more risk than there is. And in fact, there's much more business opportunity and potential profit than people are actually giving credit for. Is that right?
Well, look, I think the risk is real and there's significant risk, but there's significant opportunity, right? It's the yin and yang of this, that there's in some cases where we have the greatest uncertainty is also the potential greatest upside. And so my message to business leaders and investors is that you need to have both of them under a really strong consideration. If we're only just focusing on the risk aspect of this, then it's unlikely that your business is going to be best positioned to pivot to capture those emerging opportunities. And those $4 trillion I talked about from that report, these are big numbers we're talking about. These are not kind of round the edges, nice to do things. These are absolute game changers in terms of business models. So that kind of growth and opportunity mindset is going to be really important for business leaders to take hold of, and not just considering the risk mitigation.
We couldn't agree more because, just focusing on risk mitigation will maybe reduce harm, but it doesn't create the innovation that we need to solve for these things. So on that note, Fraser, you went back to Australia to co-found Sun Cable. What was Sun Cable all about? What was the opportunity there? Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, the reason I co-founded Sun Cable was this realization that we needed a fundamental shift in terms of the scale and the cost of renewable electricity to support the amazing economic transition that's happening in Southeast Asia, but also more broadly across the Asia-Pacific region. Now, if you take Southeast Asia as an example, Southeast Asia has this incredible wave of industrialization, growth, electrification, and also a really exciting story about a growing consuming class. And all of this adds up to significant economic growth, but it also adds up to significant growth in energy demands. So there's a real kind of hockey stick moment that Southeast Asia is in at the moment around this growth of energy demand. Now, if you look at the supply side, the challenge is that even though there's good renewable resources in many countries, a lot of it is not at the scale that can support that magnitude of demand. And that's for a couple of reasons. The principal reason is around just the population density. So the population density across Southeast Asia is roughly 100 times that a country like Australia has. So it just makes it harder to find the available land that you're going to need for many renewable electricity technologies. The second is around that many of the renewable resources are not necessarily the most efficient around Southeast Asia. So if you look at Singapore, for example, it's very difficult to do wind and tidal. On solar resources, it's not only the land, but it's also as you get closer to the equator, the solar efficiency falls quite significantly. So there's a challenge with meeting that growing demand with the right kind of renewable electricity to support that. And if you take a step back and look at electricity transmission, there's been a real revolution in this. So in Europe at the moment, they trade roughly about 13% of their electricity across borders. In the Asia Pacific, it's only about 0.3%. So we're really at the start of the journey, but new technologies, particularly around cable manufacturing, means that we can go far longer, far deeper in connecting countries than we could in the past. And this important technological revolution now means it's possible for countries like Australia to export profitably that renewable electricity to places like Southeast Asia, where it hasn't been in the past.
So the big bet with Sun Cable, really, if I understood you correctly, was that you use the abundant land resources in Australia and then literally create a solar power and transmit it to Singapore and Indonesia with a cable. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, the initial plan for Sun Cable was direct to Singapore with an undersea cable through Indonesia, but not actually landing in Indonesia. But there's the numbers. You're absolutely right on the numbers. And the opportunity. So there's roughly about 58 million petajoules of sunlight that fall on Australia every year. And to give you an equivalent of that, that's roughly enough electricity that could power the world 100 times over. So there's an abundance of solar resource in Australia. There's also an abundance of land to support this. The missing link was always, how do we transport that effectively over such a long distance? And even though we do with fiber optic cables, they crisscross the world now, and we take for granted that the internet is linked across all these different countries by these fiber optic cables. But power cables tend to be heavier, and there was always the transmission losses of the electricity in transit. But now, because of voltage improvements that have been growing at more than 10% per annum, it's a lot more cost effective to transport electricity over longer distance than it has been in the past. So that was really the missing link to transport this electricity effectively from one location to the other. And it's not just Sun Cable. There's a range of other projects that have been planned across the world, and we're going to see more and more of these across the Asia Pacific. So it's an exciting story, and one that's really important to give you a sense that if we could match Europe's target of 15% electricity traded across borders, and we did that in, say, 2040, we could remove the equivalent of 8% of global emissions. So it's one of the biggest game changers that we could do to really tackle climate change. And it creates a huge amount of other benefits in terms of energy security, lower cost and affordability, which is going to be so important to this energy transition.
And it's a real shame that it didn't come to fruition, or at least not yet, Fraser, and you're no longer part of that particular operation. But it does highlight, I guess, to a certain extent, one of the challenges of the subjects we're talking about, which is doing well by doing good, which is trying to get to a more sustainable planet. And that challenge is leadership. That challenge is being able to overcome the human problems that always bedevil huge projects like this. And so tell me about how you in your new ventures are looking at this, because I noticed that you have identified the team involved as being a critical component of how you choose your projects. Tell me about leadership. Tell me about the choice of people. Tell me about how you think that plays into the investment picture.
You look, the leadership part of this is really important. A lot of these opportunities are profitable, and if you take a sense of those $4 trillion of opportunities that I mentioned earlier, and you look at their current rates, expected rates of return, over 80% of them have internal rates of return above 10% per annum. So pretty attractive in terms of an investment standpoint. The challenge is that many of them require fundamental shifts in existing business models. And so it takes a great deal of courage for a CEO and leader of a company to actually say, look, I'm going to make those big bets and those shifts, because it's going to mean changes not only in terms of organizational skills. It's going to probably mean major supply chain and procurement changes, different engagement with customers. So quite radical shifts. So that's where we kind of really need this leadership, is that it's, even though the commercial opportunity is definitely there, these are really big changes in terms of the business models that are required to get us there. And when we think about the kind of skills that we need at Sign Ventures to get this to happen, what I came to realize is that, at Sun Cable and some of the other business ventures I'm involved in, is that we typically tend to have a very engineering-focused approach to these new technologies. And, don't get me wrong, I love engineers. I love the rigor that they bring, and they are an important element. But we need a much broader set of skills if we're going to make this transition happen. We need people who are skilled in regulatory engagement to help policymakers think about what's the right kind of frameworks that will support these opportunities that don't exist. We need people who can think about supply chains differently to fill in the supply chain gaps that we have at the moment. We need strategists who can think about how we join the dots and collaboration between all these different sectors that are going to have to come together in different ways to bring about this change. So it's quite a bigger skill requirement than we've seen in the past. And so this is part of the challenge of making it happen, but also what we think is a really exciting opportunity.
What about values, though? It's not just skills that play into leadership. Do you think that the value system that they go into business with is important? Because when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about an emphasis perhaps a little away from profit and a little bit more towards stakeholders and the broader impact of the business.
Yeah, the values is at the heart of this. And we do need to really reconnect to what are those things that we think are really important, not just as a society, but as business leaders as well. And there have been some really promising, changes in that. And I think, the work that your organization is doing in Singapore and more broadly across the region is really important part of that. It's bringing business leaders together, helping them reconnect of what is that sense of purpose, and how do we bring about that change. I think that's a really crucial part of that happening. But obviously, the values by themselves, they need to have the ecosystem around them to make it actually translate from good intentions to action on the ground. And I think that's where we'll need a lot of work around helping navigate that really good intent that business leaders may have, and actually seeing that come to fruition into the changes that we all want to see towards a more sustainable society.
On that note, you mentioned that out of the $4.4 trillion of opportunity, some are getting attention and some things are not getting attention. And you called out sustainable aviation fuel as one of those. What's the opportunity there and what's holding us back?
Yeah, so when we looked at those roughly $4 trillion of opportunities, only about a third were getting a strong focus. So 2/3 of that business opportunity iceberg, if you like, was under the water. And I think part of that is because of the one is around the information failure that I talked about earlier, that we don't have a good research analyst sector that's actively looking at this. But I think also there's other factors, that it's messy. So it's you need different skills beyond that engineering mindset. And also you need that multi-sector collaboration. So those are some of the drivers that we see of why we don't see all of these opportunities getting really active focus today. Now, one of them that we pointed attention to was sustainable aviation fuel. And sustainable aviation fuel is really important. So if you look at sort of carbon emissions, roughly about 2% of global carbon emissions today come from airlines. Now, while they're bigger sectors contributing to emissions, that number is growing really quickly. And so we need to find a way to decarbonize aviation. And it's also one of the trickiest sectors to decarbonize. So, electric aircraft, it only has certain applications, same with hydrogen. And it's jet fuel is an incredibly energy dense source. So we need to find a way to actually substitute for that to something that has got less emissions. There's different ways of doing that. You can do biofuels, and there's some really good work that's going on in biofuels. But ultimately, a lot of the research that has been shown globally is that the solution will come from what we call power to liquids. So this is taking renewable electricity, using it to produce hydrogen, then combining that with CO2 to eventually refine that into a form of jet fuel. And that's a really scalable long-term opportunity. The challenge at the moment is that the technology is still developing. So it's still relatively expensive. So we need to get further down that technology learning curve to make this competitive. But to do that, we need these lighthouse projects to get the ball rolling. So that's where we're really focusing, is around getting some of those projects going to demonstrate the potential. And if you look at the Australian context, you'd only need about 2% of Australia's land mass, and Australia could supply all of the world's global aviation fuel needs. So the supply opportunity is definitely there. We really just need to get that learning curve going by demonstrating with some of these lighthouse projects.
You also mentioned waste elimination, and the capture of value from waste elimination is an area that's not getting enough attention. What's the opportunity there?
So this is a really massive opportunity. So you look across food, just to take one example, roughly a third of food gets wasted. And there's a number of different leakage points. Sometimes it's at the post-harvest level that we just don't have the right kind of machinery to properly recoup all of the different agricultural produce. Sometimes it's in transit, where we have a lack of cold storage systems that lead food to waste. In other cases, it's more kind of at the consumer end, where we don't have good information about things like use-by dates, etc., that can help change household behaviour. So that's one particular system. But you also see the same thing in plastics, in the building construction sector, a number of really sort of, if you like, wasteful procedures in how we think about production today. So in essence, we have largely a linear production model where we produce and we consume and we dispose. And we need to move that to this circular model where we reduce to try to eliminate as much waste as possible. We look to reuse, but we also look to refurbish, repurpose, and then ultimately recycle. And that kind of approach, it's happening at different scales and in different ways, but there's still a long, long way to go. And that, I think, is a really exciting opportunity from a business standpoint. We've seen a lot of businesses, particularly in Europe, that have created whole new industries and employed thousands of people by changing that business model. But it is a really big shift. Just take finance, for example. When Michelin years ago started shifting from selling truck tires to selling truck miles, right? And they would then take back the tire and refurbish it and reuse it. That's a very different business model. You start to become more of a service business than a goods business. So rather than getting that money up front, you're basically getting lots of distributed payments. And so you need to think about your financing completely differently than you have in the past. And that's just one example. So it's a really big business model pivots that are needed to make a circular economy system work.
Whereabouts on that innovation chain do you see the most value? I mean, there are innovations like carbon capture and storage, which are way, way out into the future and, a fairly risky bet to invest in. And there are various points down the chain of innovation. Where's the sweet spot between the innovation and the scaling and the profit potential here? How do you play that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Dewa, and it's also a really tricky one to answer. I wish I had the exact answer to you on that. I think where I tend to focus is that I tend to distinguish between two types of readiness. Yeah, we talk about technological readiness levels, but we also, the other dimension is commercial readiness levels. And what has struck me is that a lot of technologies are actually relatively mature today, but we just have not developed the kind of commercial framework around them to take them into the market. And so a lot of our focus is on technologies that are relatively mature at the moment, but that need to have that commercial model to actually make them profitable and make them deployable into the marketplace. And it's something I feel like we sometimes tend to overlook. We tend to focus just that it's on its need for new technology innovation, and we tend to think about that as being in the kind of lab. And obviously that's an important part of it, but often the biggest innovation is actually just taking things from that lab and working out how do you bring it to market in a way that actually has become practical and scalable.
So on that, you mentioned there are some non-negotiable factors for success for capturing this opportunity. What are some of those?
The first thing is we really do need to improve our information fact bases. That we do have a massive information failure still, and that's in understanding the risks. So just how much is at stake, and that's starting to happen, but it still needs a long way to go. But also to put more of a spotlight on these opportunities. So as business leaders, I think building that fact base becomes really important to properly understand those risks and those opportunities that will come from this transition. The second thing is that we also need to think about multi-sector collaboration. And we talk about multi-sector collaboration a lot, but it is really crucial to making this transition happen. Of the main transitions that we looked at that will enable these opportunities, the majority had at least 5 sectors involved in them. And that's part of what makes it so difficult, right? You think about collaboration across these different sectors. But if you take a circular economy, for example, you've got an important role not only for primary producers, you've got an important role for the supply chain, you've got an important role for retailers, you've got an important role for waste and utility companies. And you've also got an important role for finance. These financial companies are going to have to develop innovative new financial models to support these shifting business models. So it's quite a big change. And working out ways that we can effectively do multi-sector collaboration to enable these opportunities is going to become really crucial. So that's, for me, one of a second building block.
What you're saying, if I heard you correctly, is this is in this new economy, you need a whole new leadership, management, or governance model which focuses on ecosystems. Because gone are the days of a single company doing anything together. And that's huge, isn't it? What's holding us back from adopting this ecosystem approach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the challenge in the past is that business leaders have often come together at different points for key events, but it's still not a muscle that is well developed in the corporate landscape. I think when business leaders have often come together in different sectors in the past, often it's been more just at a high level conversations and engagement, rather than bring it down to that next level of practical outcomes that can come out from that. So there's kind of a new muscle that really needs to be trained about how do we take that next step that moves beyond the high level conversations into really making these multi-sector collaborations work. And so there's new, interesting new models that are starting to develop that are bringing business leaders together, and particularly bringing together the level that's the N-1 below that kind of C-suite, who are going to be important to enabling this. So it's a tricky space, and I don't want to underestimate how challenging it can be, and particularly when CEOs already have a lot on their plate. So it can be difficult to give the kind of mind share that some of these things are needed, but it will be important.
When we talk about sustainability on this podcast, Fraser, we talk about doing well by doing good and doing good by doing well. and the importance of making sure that the business model is sustainable. And in the context that you're operating, I'm sort of interested to know how you balance these factors, because you seem to have set up as a venture capital model, which typically relies on that old Pareto principle of, you only need a couple of home runs out of the entire portfolio in order to make it financially viable. Is that how you're looking at this, and how much conflict is there in that between investing in a company that has sustainability at its heart and then focusing on trying to scale them rapidly into being a unicorn and therefore putting the focus on profit? Do you see what I mean? If you're operating that venture model, isn't there a big conflict between the profit imperative to grow as fast as possible and the sustainability imperative?
There is risk, right? And I won't deny that. So when we talk about these big bets, these are big bets because there's always a probability of failure. So it's when we have to be cognizant of that. There are ways of mitigating the risk associated with this. One of those aspects is that if you look in terms of kind of investment deployed and capital at risk, that follows a bit of a hockey stick, and you don't spend the money all at once. Rather, it starts to grow as you get closer to, say, a financial close and maturity of the projects. So there's a number of points in that journey of, if you like, real options where businesses can decide, look, is this tracking in the right way to justify that risk, or do we need to think again? And I think that's really important to mention. That sometimes we think that we just have to deploy a large amount of capital like that, and it's either works or it doesn't. The reality is that we have a lot more flexibility, and we can think of it as this kind of real option approach, that we start off with smaller chunks, and as this develops, the capital increases as we build our confidence. The other aspect I'd say, though, is that there is a huge risk for just business as usual, and in fact, we often say that business as usual is not a viable pathway going forward. We know the climatic risks, we know the biodiversity risks that we talked about earlier. These are going to have massive ramifications across every single sector of the economy. And that's really important to remember. It's not just if you're in the agricultural sector, for example, that you should be worried about these factors. It touches every single sector. And for those sectors who may not think that they have much exposure, those are the ones that I'm worried about most, because they probably haven't done sufficient due diligence to really understand the myriad of ways that this could impact their business. So that's important, that yes, there's risk in the transition, but there's even greater risk with the kind of businesses as usual approach if we just continue on our current trajectory.
So on that note, to sort of close this out, if you've mentioned this a couple of times today, that there has to be a mindset shift from compliance and risk mitigation to the opportunity side of things. So on that note, if there was one message you want to give to business leaders today around the world, that is this new economy, we need to take up advantage of the opportunity that climate change presents to us. If there was one message you were to give to business leaders about this mindset change from risk to opportunity, what would that be?
Look, there's a quote by the American poet Walt Whitman, which I've always liked, which he says, and I might get this slightly wrong, but it basically goes along the lines of, if you look towards the sunshine, the shadows will fall behind you. And I do think there's an important message in that, is that, yes, we need to be cognizant of the risks, but we really need to think of this as a really massive opportunity for future growth and prosperity, and put real muscle into thinking about this. And for me, that's the crucial thing for business leaders to think about. And so I often get worried when I talk to a company and the one who's leading the conversation is largely a compliance officer who's filling out all the risks and regulatory implications for the business. I want to see that the CEO, the Chief Strategy Officer, the COO, all of them engaged in really understanding what those opportunities are. So that, I guess, that would be my big message, is let's devote at least as much time to the opportunities as we do the risks. And I think businesses will be in a better place to prosper, and society as a whole will benefit a lot more.
Fantastic. Fraser, it's been been great talking to you, and best of luck with the new venture. I hope you manage to score a few home runs on these big bets.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Timur and Rajiv.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.